So we are done waiting. I think we'll start right now. So today our topic is endocrine physiology, and we'll be covering it up in about an hour. Right. So let me just start. So what is a hormone? So a hormone is derived from the Greek word that means to excite or an arouse. And basically, क्या है? Hormone is just a chemical messenger. It can act via different kinds of pathways. What are the different pathways through which it can act? It can act via an autocrine pathway or a paracrine pathway, neuroendocrine and endocrine. Let's discuss each of them in detail. So what is an autocrine pathway? Autocrine pathway is कि एक सेल है, सेल ने एक हार्मोन रिलीज किया और any cytokine, it could be anything, and that hormone acts on itself only, right? That is known as an autocrine hormone, right? For example, it could be insulin, it could be norepinephrine, right? As you can see, for example, in case it's a neuron, and if it releases something known as norepinephrine, this norepinephrine can act on the alpha 1A receptors which are present on the neuron itself. So it's a single cell, and whatever it is secreting, it's acting on upon itself. One more example I can give is example interleukin 2, right? T cells and B cells, they release interleukin 2, and later on they express interleukin 2K receptors. So that interleukin 2 works on them only, and that leads to B cell proliferation. So that is an autocrine hormone, we can say. The second thing how it can act is a paracrine hormone. मतलब एक cell type है and there is another cell type, right? Cell type 1 secretes something and that acts on the other neighboring cell. There is no, it acts via diffusion and there is no blood vessel being involved here. So it's a paracrine hormone. They're very close together. Example might include neurotransmitters, or it could include histamine. For example, histamine we can release and that can act on the vasodilation. The endothelial cells can release histamine, and that histamine, or the neurons can release histamine, and that can act on the vascular smooth muscle cells. तो हम उसे कहेंगे paracrine hormone है. एक cell type ने दूसरे को एक hormone दिया and it can work on that only. That's a paracrine pathway. Now the main thing is endocrine hormones. So what are the different things? Endocrine hormones के 3 steps हैं. First, एक secretion हुआ है of a extracellular signaling molecule which is known as a hormone. That hormone diffuses into the extracellular fluid, right? Now, extracellular fluid say that hormone should be able to diffuse into the vasculature and into the circulation throughout the whole body, and then act at a distant site. So these are the 3 definitions of an endocrine hormone. Regulated secretion होना चाहिए, it should diffuse into a vasculature, और वो किसी distant site पे act करना चाहिए. In contrast to a paracrine hormone which did not need any vasculature. So that is the definition of an endocrine hormone per se. Right? So this is an endocrine hormone. Cell type 1 secretes a hormone or a neurotransmitter that goes via the bloodstream, acts on cell type 2 and leads to an effect. Now, what are neuroendocrine hormones? Just like I was saying, these are endocrine, but they're actually secreted by the neurons. Can you name one? Example, I would say, would be vasopressin, right? Vasopressin is released from the preoptic nucleus present in the hypothalamus. हमें पता है, and that goes into these into the inferior hypophyseal vessels, which are near the pituitary. We'll be discussing about them, and then it goes into the bloodstream, right? So एक nerve cell ने एक hormone release किया, and that goes into the blood and acts on cell type 2. Okay? That's a neuroendocrine hormone. Example would be your arginavasopressin. That's the best example that we can give it. Or we can also talk about oxytocin as well. So oxytocin is a very good example as well. Let's move forwards. So how do we classify hormones? We can classify hormones on their basic structure. We can have proteins and polypeptides. Can we name some things? Anterior pituitary hormones. सारे के सारे anterior pituitary hormones are proteins or polypeptides. ठीक है? Posterior pituitary hormones are the same as well, whether it be arginavasopressin or oxytocin. Insulin, we all know, it contains 2 chains, A and B chains, and they are basically made up of amino acids. That is why we are putting them under polypeptides. Then we can have glucagon, parathormone, all of these are proteins and polypeptides. The second class of hormones we have are steroids. And what do they have? They are the steroids that are either released by the adrenal cortex. What are they? We can have cortisol being released from the zona fasciculata. We can have aldosterone being released from the zona glomerulosa. We can have estrogen and progesterone getting released, right? We can have testosterone being produced, and we can also have your placental estrogen and progesterone. So these are all steroids. And what are the next class? Derivatives of a single amino acid. Example, all of the catecholamines. For example, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine. All of these are derivatives of tyrosine, right? Or we can have thyroxine, T3, T4, वगैरह. Why are we putting T3, T4? As you all know, thyroglobulin is nothing. It's a protein which is made up of 70 amino acids of tyrosine. Okay? That is why we are putting them under derivatives of the amino acid tyrosine. Okay? And as you all know, the जो peptide hormones है सबके सब they are water soluble, ठीक है? So that is a very important thing. मतलब they're not lipid soluble, so they're not able to transfer through the lipid membrane. So they would need something which acts on the cell surface only. So इनके जो receptors होंगे, they'll be cell surface membrane receptors, not intracellular or cytoplasmic receptors. ठीक है? And often these polypeptides या protein hormones जो हैं, they're synthesized pre-pro hormones. ठीक है? What do I mean by that? जब ये synthesize होंगे from the rough endoplasmic reticulum, they need to be packaged in the endoplasmic reticulum. So how does the cell know कि अब endoplasmic reticulum में लेके जाना इन substances को? We attach a signal peptide to it. Then that signal peptide is cleaved in the endoplasmic reticulum. उसके बाद they are trafficked via the Golgi apparatus in the form of vesicles, and then they are expressed. ठीक है? So these are the hormones that we are talking about. So पहले वो pre-pro hormones हैं, they cleave to pro hormones in the ER. क्या निकल गया इनमें से? The signal peptide is removed. ठीक है? Signal peptide remove हो गया, and then they're packed into secretory vesicles. ठीक है? So that is the thing for polypeptide hormones. What about steroid hormones? Steroid hormones are mainly derived from cholesterol. Okay, cholesterol. So what is the difference? Key difference between steroid hormones and your protein hormones? They're lipid soluble. Matlab they can transverse the cell membrane very easily. So they don't need any cell surface membrane receptors. They might be very happy that they can traverse the cell membrane very freely. So steroid hormones are highly lipid soluble. We know that. And what about the amine hormones which are derived from tyrosine? दो group के hormones हैं, हमने already पढ़ लिया इन्हें. That is either the thyroid hormones, that is T3, T4, and reverse T3, or we can have the adrenal medullary hormones that include the catecholamine like norepinephrine, epinephrine, and your dopamine. Okay? They derive from tyrosine metabolism. Right? And we know the peptides in the catecholamine, they are water soluble hormones and they remain dissolved in the plasma, whereas, very importantly, steroid and thyroid hormone, they circulate in the blood mainly bound to plasma proteins. Okay? We'll be discussing them. कि कैसे different steroid hormones are bound to different globulins or albumin, and the thyroid hormones as well. Okay? Now, how do we regulate hormone secretion? We have two mechanisms, feedback regulation and we can have the nervous regulation. What do we mean by feedback regulation? कि एक जो output आया है, ठीक है, from a system, वो system को inhibit भी कर सकता है, stimulate भी कर सकता है. Do you get it? मतलब whatever is secreted from a cell that can act upon itself, it can inhibit its own secretion, or it can stimulate its own secretion. इसके accordingly we call the feedback to be positive, negative, right? We can have something known as feed forward, that is different, but we are talking about feedback regulation. Feed forward is predicting for the future. Okay? We don't know whether the change has happened or not, we just predict for it. Isme the change has actually occurred, it is in the form of an effect, and it can act as a positive or a negative feedback mechanism, right? So let's just discuss main question यहाँ पे जो जितना आता है, that is on the different examples of mainly positive feedback mechanism, because there are innumerable examples of negative feedback mechanisms. Okay? So what is happening in endocrine gland, it secretes a hormone. Hormone can act on a target organ, it can form physiological effects, right? And then that exerts a negative feedback mechanism upon itself. That is a negative feedback thing. And okay, so we now discuss something known as long loop, short loop, and ultra short loop. Let me just tell it to you. What do I mean by that? For example, if we have a hormone which is getting released from the hypothalamus, मान लो this is a hormone 1, okay? It's a hormone. Then that hormone can act on the hormone 1. It can act on the pituitary to produce hormone 2, right? And it can act on some endocrine organ, for example, to produce any hormone, that is hormone 3. Okay? Ultimately, the effect is hormone 3 is getting released. If this only inhibits its own secretion, then that is known as your ultra short loop. Then this is known as your short loop, and this is known as your long loop. You get it? It is at the level of organization, बस हमारा फर्क change हो रहा है कि जो हमारा ultra short loop है, that is at the level of the hypothalamus. The short loop is at the level of the pituitary, and then you have the long loop, which is getting from the endocrine gland or the effector gland. Okay? So what are the long loop feedback control? Hormones secreted by the peripheral endocrine organs provide a negative feedback to either the hypothalamus or the pituitary. What about the short loop feedback? That is anterior pituitary hormone, they act upon themselves to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus को inhibit कर रहे हैं, right? And what about the ultra short? Hypothalamus से जो hormones release हो रहे हैं, वही hypothalamus के hormones के secretion को inhibit कर रहे हैं. Then that is known as your ultra short loop. So this is depicted here. For example, hypothalamus से एक hormone release हो रहा है. If it inhibits its own secretion, then that's an ultra short loop. This hormone acts on the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary releases some other hormone. If that hormone inhibits its own secretion via the hypothalamus, then that's a short loop. and then obviously we can have the peripheral endocrine organ gland के level पे we can have the long loop, right? And उसके accordingly we can even discuss whether the disease is primary or secondary. Mind you, primary मतलब कि endocrine gland, peripheral endocrine gland में problem है, ठीक है? Very important. So this is primary lesion, okay? For example, we call something known as primary hypoaldosteronism, or we can have something known as primary hypocortisolism, anything like that. So whenever we are having stuff like that, we should be focused कि primary का मतलब ये है कि adrenal gland के level पे अगर problem है, if you're talking about cortisol, right? So that is primary lesion, ठीक है? What about the secondary lesion? Secondary could be either in, वैसे तो it should be either at the level of the anterior pituitary, और टर्शरी अगर हम कह रहे हैं तो इट इज एट द लेवल ऑफ द हाइपोथैलेमस, मतलब लीजन जो है इसके अकॉर्डिंगली अरेंज रहती है, ठीक है? एंड वी विल बी डिस्कसिंग देम शॉर्टली एज वेल. So this is the negative feedback and the positive feedback mechanism. Feed forward control I was telling you about, guys, कि feed forward का मतलब है एक prediction करना है कि change is about to occur, ठीक है? And अभी change हुआ ही नहीं है, and then you mainly give some anticipatory response predicting what is going to happen, ठीक है? That's a feed forward control. A very important MCQ again. What is the gain of a control system? This is just for calculation. Sometimes they ask you कि baroreceptor है, उसने इतना gain, इतना उसने correction कर दिया, and this is the amount of residual error that is left that you subtract and find it out, ठीक है? So these are very frequent MCQs that are being asked. तो gain कैसे calculate करना है? That is a correction जो कि उस चीज ने achieve किया. It could be baroreceptors. Mostly baroreceptors का example देते हैं. Divided by the residual error which is still being left. That is known as the gain of the system. So a very important MCQ can come from here as well. What is the gain, right? Okay. So what are some positive feedback loop ke mechanism? Let's just quickly see. Blood clotting, we know it. We're going to discuss this in hematology. You know, parturition and childbirth, very important. Again, a positive feedback mechanism. LH surge, we studied in gynecology as well. So LH surge is very important. Generation of nerve signals is a positive feedback mechanism, and very importantly, as we discuss in nerve muscle physiology, everything is linked, guys. The Hodgkin cycle, ठीक है? But what was the Hodgkin cycle? कि whenever we have depolarization, what it will lead to? It led to sodium channel का opening. So whenever the sodium channels are being opened, wouldn't they lead to more depolarization? And that depolarization will further lead to more opening of sodium channels. So it's a positive feedback mechanism. This is known as the Hodgkin cycle. As well as we have activation of the digestive enzymes. Once pepsinogen is cleaved and converted into pepsin, that's going to convert more pepsinogen into pepsin, right? So it's an autocatalytic process. So these are the different mechanisms, positive feedback. Okay? Now, very importantly, we need to discuss what are the mechanism of action of these hormones, right? We'll be going a little bit fast now. तो mechanism hormone क्या है? अगर हमारा protein, peptide या catecholamine hormones है, they're what? They're water soluble hormones. Can they traverse through the membrane? No, they can't. So they would need some receptor which is on the cell membrane. So whenever we talk about their receptors, for example, insulin है, insulin का receptor हम कहाँ पढ़ते हैं? We studied at the cell surface membrane, है ना? Just like that, cell cytoplasm में जो receptors हैं वो receptors होंगे for that hormone which is lipid soluble. And what were they? Steroid hormones. So steroid hormones are cell cytoplasmic receptors or nuclear receptors. And last में nucleus के लिए mainly we can have thyroid hormone के receptors. ठीक है? We are going to discuss that. So receptor regulation क्या हो सकता है? Just few terms. You can have down regulation of receptors or we can have up regulation of receptors. ठीक है? Whenever something कम release होती है, for example, किसी nerve से अगर norepinephrine कम release हो रहा है, so what does happen? Post synaptic membrane पे there's an up regulation of receptors because we know यार थोड़ी सी deficiency हो रही है. Let me just up regulate the amount of receptors that we have. And the same happens with down regulation of receptors as well. Whenever अगर high concentration of hormone है, that leads to down regulation of receptors so that pathological process कोई ना execute हो. ठीक है? So that is known as receptor regulation. That's very much easy. So अब वो कैसे होता है down regulation और up regulation of receptors? We can't discuss that. ठीक है? So basically down regulation के case में we can have only the internalization of the receptors. ठीक है? Caveolin molecules होते हैं. Caveolin are these rafts जो कि क्या करते हैं? वो receptor को अंदर की तरफ खींच लेते हैं. So that is the down regulation of these receptors. ठीक है? So how can the down regulation of the receptors can have? या तो so we'll just skip over that. इतना important नहीं है. Let's just talk about the signaling now. तो signaling mainly हमारे पास कौन कौन सी है? We can have cell surface hormone receptors, है ना? उनकी signaling क्या क्या है? We're going to discuss. एक तो है ion channel link receptors. What are they known as? They're known as inotropic receptors, aren't they? They're known as inotropic receptors. We can have your GPCRs, that is your G protein link hormone receptors, और we can have your enzyme linked hormone receptors. ये तीनों हम डिस्कस करेंगे. एंड इंटरसेलुलर हार्मोन के रिसेप्टर्स जो हैं या तो वो न्यूक्लियर हो सकते हैं और दे कैन बी साइटोप्लाज्मिक, मेनली हमारे थायराइड एंड स्टेरॉइड हार्मोन्स के लिए, राइट? So this is what's happening. Now let's discuss each one of them in detail, and basically abhi aapko kya karna hai, you just have to see and I'm going to tell you where are they found, right? For example, ion channel linked receptors. Let's just see कौन से can we figure it out, and let's just try to remember that. Okay. For example, let's have GABA. So GABA के लिए, so जो GABA के लिए जो receptors हैं, whether they be GABA A or they can have GABA B receptors, ठीक है? इस केस में जो GABA A receptors जो हैं हमारे, they are basically inotropic receptors. मतलब वो receptor जब भी ligand उससे bind करेगा, जो कि GABA है इस केस में, that receptor is going to become into a channel. And what does it channel, उसकी conductance क्या है channel की? Basically for chloride. And what will it lead to? It will lead to hyperpolarization, है ना, of the membrane. So that is one, easy to remember. GABA is one inotropic receptor. The second might be acetylcholine, हमारा वही friend. acetylcholine का हमने receptor के बारे में हमने बहुत detail में पढ़ा था nerve muscle physiology में. So that is the same thing, दो binding sites है उसमें, ठीक है? Same we can have for ATP as well. We have studied again. We can have the purinergic receptors कहते हैं उन्हें. That is P2X and P2Y. इस केस में जो P2X receptor है, that is your inotropic receptor. So what about glutamate? Glutamate के लिए NMDA receptor है, and we should not even forget the AMPA receptor as well. ठीक है? AMPA and NMDA, both of them are inotropic receptors. ठीक है? And NMDA basically plays a role in long-term potentiation, जो हम will discuss it somewhere else. Okay? So these are some of the extracellular ligands की हम जब बात करते हैं. Alright? So yeah. So next we are going to discuss about the G protein linked receptors. So what do I mean by G proteins? Okay. So actually G proteins जो हैं, we can have two types of G proteins. We can have large G proteins, or we can have smaller G proteins. ठीक है? अभी जो what we are going to discuss are the large G proteins. What do I mean by large? ये जो G proteins हैं, they basically have three units. Okay. You have an alpha unit, a beta unit, and a gamma unit. Okay. So abhi we are going to discuss about these guys. That is your large G protein receptors, or the large G protein linked with that receptors. So what is a G protein? It's a protein which is made up of three parts: alpha, beta, and gamma. Right? Ab kya hoega? Let's just discuss that. So whenever a transmitter binds to this receptor, how is this receptor framed to be as? It's a serpentine receptor. What do I mean by a serpentine receptor? It has these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 transmembrane domains. They're mainly made up of alpha chains, right? Secondary structure of proteins, alpha chains. So these are what we are talking about. And what are they linked with? They're linked with this protein known as a G protein. Okay, what does it? इसके 3 units हैं, alpha, beta, and gamma units are there. So whenever a ligand binds here, what's going to happen is this GDP, which is bound to this G protein. ठीक है, किस यूनिट से? अल्फा यूनिट से. सो अल्फा यूनिट के पास जीडीपी जब बाइंड होता है, then that whole complex is inactive. Whenever what happens is, whenever the ligand binds to this, it's going to undergo a conformational change, and the GDP is going to be substituted with GTP. And as soon as that happens, this alpha GTP is going to break away from the beta gamma subunit. तो क्या हो गया? बीटा गामा अलग चले गए, and your alpha अलग चला गया, and it is bound to GTP and it is active. ठीक है? Just remember, alpha ऐसा नहीं है कि alpha को GTP मिल गया है, now it's going to be constitutively active. किसी टाइम के लिए वो रहेगा. And how do we ensure that? Actually alpha unit कुछ नहीं है, it has a GTP as activity. Ultimately this GTP is going to be broken down into GTP, और ये constitutive action नहीं रहेगा. क्यों मैं इतना emphasize कर रहा हूँ? Because sometimes we forget कि there is something, ये जो alpha subunit को जो कोड करता है जीन, that is GNAS, right? And this might be your homework. Can you name any mutation जिसके कारण GNAS का constitutive activation होता है? ठीक है? So that is your homework. उस केस में it's there. So what's going to happen next? Once the alpha unit is activated, what can happen? या तो वो किसी channel को open कर सकता है, one thing, or it can close that channel as well. It can activate some enzymes. अभी हम discuss करेंगे कौन से enzymes. It can lead to changes in the protein and the structural changes as well by modulating transcription and translation of DNA. So this was alpha done. अब वो कौन सी subunit of alpha है, उसके accordingly हम उसके functions हम enumerate करेंगे. Let me just tell you. So G proteins actually जो हम पढ़ते हैं, they're made up of three mainly उसके big subfamilies हैं. We can have GS type of G proteins, we can have GI, or we can have GQ. GI, GO भी कहते हैं, दोनों सेम बात है. So what does GS mean? I am saying अभी alpha subunit, when it is bind to GTP, when it is active, it's going to activate one enzyme. अभी हम ये बात कर रहे हैं. So what is that enzyme which is getting activated in case of GS? GS stands for stimulatory. So it's going to stimulate an enzyme known as adenyl cyclase. Okay? And what is adenyl cyclase going to do? It's going to convert your ATP into your cyclic AMP. So matlab cyclic AMP levels will increase. What is the case of GI? GI stands for inhibitory. So it's going to inhibit the same enzyme, that is adenyl cyclase, but it's going to decrease the amount of cyclic AMP present inside the cell. And what about the GQ? GQ is going to activate one enzyme known as phospholipase C. Alright? What does this phospholipase C do? If you talk about the lipid membrane, lipid bilayer जो हम कहते हैं, वहाँ पे you have PIP residues there. Phosphatidylinositol diphosphate residues, PIP. ठीक है? So अभी क्या होगा? This PIP, very good, PIP actually breaks down into your IP3 inositol triphosphate plus diacyl glycerol, and they are going to play some role with calcium. Calcium is different in this case. ठीक है? अभी के लिए अभी हमने क्या डिस्कस किया? We discussed about the subfamilies of the G protein. Let's discuss आगे. So what do we have? The alpha subunit of these जो three types of G proteins है, they could be GS, they could be GI, they could be GQ. ठीक है? Alpha S, उसके accordingly ही उनके units will be also alpha S, alpha I, and alpha Q. So what does activation of the alpha S subunit do? It's going to activate this enzyme known as adenyl cyclase, promote cyclic AMP formation. Done. What about alpha I subunit? It's going to inhibit this enzyme known as adenyl cyclase, and it's going to decrease the cyclic AMP formation. Done. And what about GQ? GQ की जो alpha Q subunit है, it's going to activate this enzyme known as phospholipase C, and it's going to increase the amount of IP3 and DAG. ठीक है? This is what is happening, right, guys? So we can have the यहाँ पे अब इन्होंने basically different examples लिए हैं. For example, we can see in this case this is an alpha 1 receptor. ठीक है? Alpha 1 receptors are mainly present in the vascular smooth muscle cells, and what do are linked with? They are linked with GQ. तो इसका मतलब बहुत clear है. तो GQ क्या करेगा? It's going to activate this enzyme known as phospholipase C. मतलब alpha Q subunit activate कर देगा phospholipase C को. इससे क्या होगा? PIP2 gets broken down into DAG and IP3. And what does this IP3 will do? यहाँ पे sarcoplasmic reticulum है, if you see. तो this sarcoplasmic reticulum के पास एक receptor है. And कमाल की बात है, receptor का नाम भी IP3 receptor है. So what is this receptor? This receptor is actually a calcium channel. Whenever IP3 binds to this receptor, it's going to open the calcium channel, and इसके through calcium is going to go out and mediate further effects. ठीक है? Next, we can have alpha 2. Alpha 2 is GI link, तो ये cyclic AMP को कम करेगा. And we can see beta receptors जो हैं, they are GS link, तो वे cyclic AMP को बढ़ाएगा. So these were the effects of adrenaline and noradrenaline. Now we'll move on to enzyme link receptors. ठीक है? So what are these enzyme link receptors? तो इनके साथ कुछ ना कुछ enzyme linked है. We talked about the G protein couple receptors. अब enzyme link receptors पे आ गए. So what are they? Example, in case of ANP, that is atrial natriuretic peptide, इसके साथ जो enzyme जो linked है, that is G-guanyl cyclase. Okay, what is that going to produce? That's going to produce cyclic GMP, and we know the cyclic GMP. What is that going to facilitate? That's going to facilitate relaxation. ठीक है? Cyclic GMP is going to activate protein kinase G, and that's going to lead to activation of myosin light chain phosphatase, which is going to break the myosin light chain से जो भी phosphate present है. ठीक है? Example next is insulin. What does insulin have as an enzyme? It has tyrosine kinase. What is it going to do? Attach phosphate residues. So again, it's an enzyme linked receptor. Let's discuss growth hormone now. Growth hormone के पास ऐसा क्या है? It has again difference ये है, यहाँ पे tyrosine kinase domains है, but यहाँ पे जो different growth hormone के case में है, it has JAK. What is this? Janus kinase. It's a kinase again. It's a tyrosine kinase again, but नाम बस change हो गया, Janus kinases. ठीक है? So ये हमारे हो गए enzyme linked receptors. Guanyl cyclase, we talked about this, how it can lead to stuff, and we talked about the receptor tyrosine kinase, जो भी हम insulin के case में discuss कर रहे थे, receptor tyrosine kinases. So what are the different hormones that we have to see? Insulin mainly, ठीक है? Receptor tyrosine kinases, right? And we also have Janus kinases, and Janus kinases plays a very important role in case of growth hormone as well. ठीक है? अब Janus kinase कैसे function करता है? Once the Janus kinase is activated, it's going to attach phosphate residues to each other, और ये जो पूरा receptor complex है, it's going to dimerize. Can't we see? Dimerize कर गया वो दोनों के दोनों. Once these are dimerized, in JAK kinase के साथ, they're going to what do they do? Once these are phosphorylated, ये जो receptor है phosphorylate कर जाएगा, इस पे something is going to bind. What is that something? That is known as STAT. ठीक है? What is this stat? This is signal transducer and transcription. Okay, signal transducer and activator of transcription, stat. So these stat proteins are linked. So that is the jack stat mechanism जिसे हम कहते हैं. And what about the intracellular hormone receptors? We already know what are they mainly for. They're mainly for steroid hormones and your thyroid hormones, even retinoid hormones, like for vitamin A and even vitamin D hormones. All of them are intracellular hormone receptors, either cytoplasmic or nuclear. Okay? So this is what is happening. Most of these receptors are lipid. So they are going to bind with a protein carrier. Example, हम ले रहे हैं यहाँ पे steroid hormone. It's going to traverse the cell membrane because it's lipid soluble. It might join with a cytoplasmic receptor. ठीक है, बहुत सारे केसेस में it is usually a heat shock protein. It binds to a cytoplasmic receptor and then that gets internalized and basic, और या फिर क्या हो सकता है, it binds to a nuclear receptor that gets internalized into the nucleus and that facilitate transcription and translation. ठीक है, so these are right. Next we move on to secondary messenger mechanisms. ठीक है, सेकेंडरी मैसेंजर मैकेनिज्म्स का मतलब ये है कि सेल सरफेस से जो भी आपका हार्मोन आया है, जो भी आपका सिग्नल आ रहा है, हाउ डू वी कन्वे इट फर्दर. सो दैट इज द सेकेंडरी मैसेंजर मैकेनिज्म्स. तो व्हाट आर दे, हमने ऑलरेडी पढ़ ली है. वी कैन हैव साइक्लिक केएमपी एज अ सेकेंडरी मैसेंजर, साइक्लिक जीएमपी एज अ सेकेंडरी मैसेंजर, द IP3 डैग पाथवे एज द सेकेंडरी मैसेंजर, और वी कैन हैव कैल्शियम एज द सेकेंडरी मैसेंजर. अभी हमारा जॉब क्या है? हमारा जॉब इज टू रिमेंबर कौन से सेकेंडरी मैसेंजर इज फॉर विच हार्मोन. दैट इज द मेन थिंग. So let's just move on to straight to that. This is again the G protein coupled receptors. So let's just see. So what are the different hormones that work by increasing the cyclic AMP formation? We just have to remember their names. इस case में mostly they're anterior pituitary hormones, as we can see. Growth hormone releasing hormone. This is CRH, that is hypothalamus से जो release होता है, corticotropin releasing hormone. We can have GnRH, FSH, LH. Then we can have norepinephrine via beta-1 receptor, surely that increase cyclic AMP formation. Or we can have ADH via the V2 receptor. Why am I mentioning the V2 receptor? V1 receptors are basically GQ linked, but V2 receptors are basically GS linked. They're going to increase the cyclic AMP formation. And what are going to decrease cyclic AMP now? Norepinephrine via the alpha 2 receptor, as we saw previously, and somatostatin. They're going to decrease their GI linked receptors. Okay? So let's move forwards. Yeah, so this is the main thing. You can take this as a screenshot or something. Adenyl cyclase पे क्या क्या वर्क करे हमने ऑलरेडी पढ़ लिया. मेनली आई वुड लाइक यू टू सी ADH पे फोकस करना है, यहाँ पे V2 रिसेप्टर पे, एंड ADH पे फोकस करना है यहाँ पे V1 रिसेप्टर पे. ये बहुत बार पूछते हैं. V2 रिसेप्टर्स जो कि इंसर्ट करता है एक्वापोरिन रिसेप्टर, जो हमने रीनल फिजियोलॉजी में पढ़ा था, एक्वापोरिन टाइप 2. एंड ADH क्या मीडिएट कराएगा वाया V1 रिसेप्टर? इट्स गोइंग टू मीडिएट योर वेजोकंस्ट्रिक्शन. ठीक है, बिकॉज इट इज फॉस्फोलाइपेज C लिंक, तो ये कैल्शियम का रोल प्ले कर रहा है, तो कैल्शियम लीड्स टू vasoconstriction. What else are some phospholipase C linked receptors? We can have angiotensin 2, again plays a role in vasoconstriction. We can have oxytocin against uterotonic, हम जिसे कहते हैं, again that's going to lead to contraction of the smooth muscles in the uterus, as well as alpha adrenergic agonist via which receptor? Alpha 1 receptor. ठीक है. And whenever we are talking about beta receptors, we are mainly talking about your GS linked receptors. They're going to increase the amount of cyclic AMP now. तो साइटोप्लाज्मिक एंड न्यूक्लियर कौन से हो गए? कॉर्टिसोल, एस्ट्राडियोल, प्रोजेस्टेरोन, टेस्टोस्टेरोन. दीज आर सेक्स स्टेरॉइड्स, एंड योर कॉर्टिसोल ऊपर एल्डोस्टेरोन, कैल्सिट्रियोल दैट इज विटामिन डी, एंड थायराइड हार्मोन्स. टायरोसिन काइनेज, इफ यू सी व्हाट आर दे? इंसुलिन लाइक ग्रोथ फैक्टर जो हम डिस्कस करेंगे, एंड ग्रोथ हार्मोन. एंड इन केस ऑफ गुआनिल साइक्लेस इट इज ANP एंड योर नाइट्रिक ऑक्साइड. ठीक है, दे आर गोइंग टू लीड टू वेजोडाइलेशन, रिलैक्सेशन बेसिकली, एंड नाइट्रियूरेसिस. ठीक है. So now let's move on to the hypothalamus now. So let's just discuss hypothalamus for some other time, because let's just consider it as a part of CNS only, वरना आज का सेशन बहुत लंबा हो जाएगा. So we're going to straight away jump into the pituitary now. ठीक है. So let's here we have the pituitary. What are the different parts of the pituitary? We have the anterior pituitary, we know, and we have the posterior pituitary. ठीक है, दो parts हैं इसके. Anterior pituitary is also known as the adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary is also known as the neurohypophysis. क्यों इसका मतलब है? Neurohypophysis means posterior pituitary must be developing from the CNS, and that is the way posterior pituitary is actually developed from the diencephalon. ठीक है. Diencephalon क्या है हमारा? जो prosencephalon है, that gets broken down, मतलब prosencephalon develops into telencephalon and your diencephalon, and this diencephalon is the one which gives rise to the posterior pituitary. And what about the anterior pituitary? That develops from the Rathke's spout, which is what? It's an invagination of the primitive pharynx. ठीक है. So this is the thing. We have different चीजें यहाँ पे. तो anterior pituitary hormones जो है, इसके जो सारे secretory cells है ना, वो यहीं पे present है. We are going to discuss these amount of cells. Let me just turn your attention towards the posterior pituitary. वो ज़्यादा important है. Posterior pituitary की बात ये यहाँ पे सिर्फ hormones stored होते हैं. They're not released from, they're only released from here, but इनका जो site of production है, that is mainly in the hypothalamus. And we have to remember the nuclei for each. Supraoptic nuclei releases ADH, and your the next one, supraoptic nucleus हो गया, right? So supraoptic nucleus basically releases your vasopressin, that is your ADH, right? Next we move on to the different types of anterior pituitary hormones. As we see, different types हैं हमारे पास बहुत सारे. We can have prolactin releasing hormone, we can have PIH, that is prolactin inhibitory hormone, which is nothing but dopamine. Then we can have your TRH, that is thyrotropin releasing hormone. These are all released from the hypothalamus. ये सारे hypothalamus वाले हैं. यहाँ पे अभी हम वर्क करें, that is the anterior pituitary. It releases prolactin, it releases TSH, ACTH, growth hormone, LH and FSH, right? So ये हमारे anterior pituitary hormones हैं. Just remember your hypothalamic nucleus से कौन कौन से release होते हैं. That is your paraventricular nucleus and your ADH from the supraoptic nucleus वो release हो रहे हैं. Oxytocin and your ADH. Next we move on to where is the pituitary located. We know it's located in the sphenoid bone के वहाँ पे located है, and it is covered by the diaphragma sellae. It is often related to the cavernous sinus as well, and this we're not going to discuss that in detail. What are the different anatomical relations of the cavernous sinus? You can see it on your own, right? What I want to turn your attention towards is different types of cells which are present in the pituitary. We can have three types of cells. We can have acidophils, we can have chromophores, or we can have basophils, right? What are acidophils? Acidophils are going to stain acid, like eosin से stain करेंगे, that is acidophils. Basophils are going to stay basic, and your chromophores are not going to take any color, as we can see. पूरा गोरा, it's no color. So what are the acidophil cells? They're also known as epsilon cells. तो हम इन्हें collectively कहते हैं somatolactotropes, because इनमें कौन कौन से cells included हैं? The cells which secrete growth hormone, that is somatotropes, and the cell which release prolactin, that is your lactotropes. Chromophores में क्या आएंगे हमारे? Melanotropes आएंगे. They're going to secrete MSH, that is melanocyte stimulating hormone. And last में we can have your basophils. They're known as the delta cells. तो ये क्या है? They're going to stain basic. क्या क्या आएंगे इसमें? Thyrotropes, corticotropes and gonadotropes, right? So one more thing, POMC क्या है? Pre-opiomelanocortin. ठीक है? It's a very big hormone. इसमें से बहुत सारे different components निकलते हैं. For example, pre-opiomelanocortin अगर कोई पूछे क्या क्या निकलता है उनमें से, mainly अभी we have to remember सिर्फ beta MSH release होता है. We are talking about those animals which don't have the intermediate lobe of the pituitary. That is what I mean by IL, intermediate lobe. तो इन दोनों को भूल जाना है. Beta MSH release होता है, then your beta lipotropin is often released, and your ACTH is released. ठीक है? ACTH, your gamma MSH, beta MSH, and your beta lipoprotein, POMC के parts हैं. So alpha and beta MSH do not circulate in human. That is very important. ठीक है? So now we're going to discuss something about the growth hormone now. So growth hormone, just remember, it's species specific. What do I mean by that? Because sometimes dairy products may be just used. Dairy products may, whenever who are farmers which are involved in the dairy industry, they use growth hormones. ठीक है? तो जो don't think कि वो जो growth hormones वो cattle पे use करते हैं, they can go into the milk and then act on our growth hormones or our growth hormone receptor. That is not so. So it's species specific. ठीक है? 191 amino acids का ये है. Chromosome 17 इसे कोड करता है. And what do I mean? Last thing, it is 50% जो ये hormone है, it's a protein hormone. So 50% of this polypeptide is bound to the extracellular domain of its own receptor. तो growth hormone जो receptor है मान लो, उसी का ये extracellular domain cleave off हो जाता है, and that binds the growth hormone and regulates its amount. So 50% is already bound. What are the basal levels that we have in our body? 3 nanogram per ml. ठीक है? Now this is how it acts. We've already seen कि growth hormone कैसे act करता है, mainly by the Janus kinase pathway. Janus kinase recruits these STAT particles. So what do I mean by STAT? That is signal transduction and activator of transcription. So STAT, JAK-STAT pathway के through ये work करता है, और we can say tyrosine kinase domains के through ये work करता है, right? So this is what is happening. We've already seen that. What does it do? So let's just see what are the different functions of the growth hormone. Carbohydrate metabolism पे क्या function है इसका? It has a diabetogenic effect. मतलब it's going to stimulate gluconeogenesis as well as it's going to decrease the glucose uptake from the muscles in the adipose tissue. ठीक है? But an indirect effect of your growth hormone is to increase insulin. ऐसा नहीं है कि growth hormone directly acts on the beta cells to increase insulin. It is only the fact कि growth hormone के कारण whatever hyperglycemia that you achieve, that is the glucose which is responsible for stimulating the beta cells, and we know the insulin secretion we're going to discuss, and uske through insulin is released secondarily, not primarily. ठीक है? So insulin obviously is increased whenever you give growth hormone, but mainly it has a diabetogenic effect. ठीक है? Next thing, protein metabolism. Just remember, it is a not a catabolic protein, it's an anabolic protein. It's going to build up your protein. Lean body mass को increase करता है. So what do I mean by lean body mass? मतलब fat कम, protein ज़्यादा. अभी यही हम follow करेंगे. तो amino acid uptake is going to increase. Transcription translation is going to increase, as well as it's going to decrease the catabolism of protein. मतलब ये protein sparer effect है. ठीक है? Very importantly, fat metabolism की अगर हम बात करें, fat metabolism में भी it's going, what is it going to do? It's going to enhance the oxidation of these free fatty acids to acetyl CoA and generate energy. मतलब it's not a fat sparer, ठीक है? It's a protein sparer, but fat को ये burn करेगा, ठीक है? As well as it's going to increase the production of ketone bodies, so ये ketogenic भी है, तो it's diabetogenic as well as ketogenic, ठीक है? What about the effect on growth? जब तक एपिफाइसिस क्लोज नहीं है तो इट्स गोइंग टू इंक्रीज कॉन्ड्रोजेनेसिस, इंक्रीज द विड्थ ऑफ द एपिफाइसल ग्रोथ प्लेट एंड हेंस इंक्रीज लीनियर ग्रोथ करवाएगा. बट वंस द एपिफाइसिस आर क्लोज, लीनियर ग्रोथ इज नॉट पॉसिबल. वी नो दैट. नाउ व्हाट डू वी हैव? वी हैव समथिंग नोन एज सोमैटोमेडिन्स, राइट? सो व्हाट आर दीज? जो ग्रोथ हार्मोन जो है, एक्चुअली सम साइंटिस्ट से दैट्स नॉट एक्चुअली ग्रोथ हार्मोन जो अपने इफेक्ट्स करवा रहा है. इट वर्क्स बाय एन इंटरमीडिएट मॉलिक्यूल नोन एज सोमैटोमेडिन्स. व्हाट आर दीज? Growth hormone works on the liver to produce these somatomedins. Okay, how are they? So we are saying somatomedins. So what are they known as? They are known as insulin-like growth factors, IGF. Why are they so insulin-like? Insulin के भी आप A and B chains इस केस में, and the C chain भी होती है जो कि later on cleave हो जाती है. But why are these known as insulin-like growth factors? Because इसमें जो C peptide it's not separated. It's a part of it only. ठीक है? So that is why they're insulin-like growth factors. अभी हमें एक ही पढ़ना है, that is IGF-1, which is somatomedin C. Adult life में IGF-1 plays a role, whereas IGF-2 plays only a role in fetal development. ठीक है? IGF-1 plays a role in fetal development. So in MCQ, in case of pediatric, growth hormone per se does not play a role in intrauterine height. Even if someone says IGF-1, it also doesn't play a role in intrauterine height. It's only IGF-2 which plays a role in intrauterine growth. ठीक है? And when I say it's insulin-like growth factor, मतलब इसके सारे effects are going to be of insulin. What are the effects of insulin? Insulin-like effect इसका मतलब ये है lipolysis को inhibit करना, ठीक है? And lipogenesis कराना, just like insulin. As well as it's going to increase the amount of glucose uptake in the muscles as well and the adipose, just like insulin. तो anti-diabetogenic हम कह सकते हैं, opposite, ठीक है? As well as it's going to increase protein synthesis and epiphyseal growth, ठीक है? So again, another table. What are the different stimuluses which lead to growth hormone secretion? कम कराना है, बढ़ाना, ये हमें देखना है. तो hypoglycemia, starving, fasting, hypoglycemia or exercise all are going to increase the growth hormone synthesis. Growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus also releases growth hormone, obviously. L-DOPA important है. Glucagon is very important because glucagon हम use करते हैं as a stimulation test for growth hormone testing. So L-DOPA, alpha-2 agonist, exercise, fasting, some amount of amino acid which are obviously present in these muscle protein that we use, है ना, in the gyms वगैरह, they have very high amount of arginine as well, because arginine is going to stimulate your growth hormone synthesis. ठीक है? Then we have D2 receptor agonists as well, any stressful stimuli, and very importantly is NREM sleep and ghrelin. So these are the things which stimulate growth hormone synthesis. What inhibits growth hormone? Glucose. Whenever glucose is there, growth hormone is going to get inhibited. Cortisol is going to inhibit growth hormone. REM sleep, there was NREM here, यहाँ पे REM sleep is going to inhibit growth hormone, right? Free fatty acids ज़्यादा हो रहे हैं, that's going to inhibit growth hormone. Aging, as you age, your growth hormone releases. That is why some scientists were saying, let's use growth hormone for your anti-aging effects, right? And then obviously, like feedback mechanisms, somatomedins and growth hormone, वो खुद का synthesis तो obviously inhibit करेंगे ही. Somatostatin, that is growth hormone inhibitory hormone. And just remember, chronic malnutrition, which we study in something known chronic malnutrition जो है, that leads to growth hormone resistance per se, not growth hormone decrease in secretion. Okay? So this is what is happening. We've already seen the different mechanisms how it does that. कि somatostatin जो है वो inhibit करेगा growth hormone को. IGF-1 is going to inhibit, it's going to stimulate somatostatin, and it's also going to inhibit growth hormone. Okay? And these are different stimuluses that we have already seen. Right? So now let's just move on to the thyroid now. Okay? We have thoda less time, so I'm going to rush now. Thyroid. So पहली thing is वो thyroid hypothalamus से शुरू करते हैं. Hypothalamus releases something known as the TRH. Why am I so concerned about the TRH? TRH is the smallest hormone in the body. अगर especially अगर protein hormones की अगर हम बात करें, it is only made up of 3 amino acids. So what is its name? It's pyroglutamyl histidyl prolinamide. 3 amino acids का hormone कौन सा है? TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. So this TRH obviously works on the TSH, and then TSH works on the different follicular cells which we're going to study. How does the thyroid develop? We know कि foramen cecum से thyroglossal duct निकलता है, which grows downwards, है ना? And उसी का ही एक remnant which we study it as the pyramidal lobe that we study in anatomy of the surgery में जो हम पढ़ते हैं basically. तो अभी हम we're not going to discuss that. Just remember it's a endodermal derivative. मतलब pharynx का ही developed है. तो pharynx और gut tube in fact is endodermal derivative है. तो this is the development. ठीक है? Now let's going to discuss what happens and how is thyroid synthesized actually. ठीक है? तो पहले we need iodine. ठीक है? So this is a follicular cell that we have in view, and obviously we need iodine for synthesizing your T3 or T4. ठीक है? The thing is, how do we concentrate iodine? So it's not only कि thyroid में there is mechanisms to concentrate iodine. There are multiple other things as well. So there is something known as the sodium iodide symporter. So this is the symporter which transports iodine inside the follicular epithelial cells with sodium. The coupling ratio is 2:1, but the 2 sodium are transported inside for every 1 iodide being transferred into the follicular epithelial cells. So what is this transporter? NIS. Where is it present? Again, an MCQ. Obviously, it's going to be present in the thyroid, but we often forget what are the different sites. Thyroid hai, there is salivary glands, there is the placenta, the ciliary body, the choroid plexus present in the ventricles, as well as the mammary glands. You have to remember this list, okay? Salivary glands, placenta, ciliary body, choroid plexus, and the mammary glands. So now the iodine is inside. Done. So what do we do next? We already talked about कि जो T3 and T4 है, they are amino acid derivative hormones, like they're made up of tyrosine derivatives, right? So how do we derive that? The tyrosine is basically forming something known as thyroglobulin. Okay, it's a very big protein, and it composes of basically जो हमारा colloid होता है, that's made up of thyroglobulin. So this thyroglobulin is going inside the follicular lumen. So it's here. What about iodide? Iodide is also going to enter into the lumen only. Okay, via which transporter? Here is we have another transporter here, that is pendrin. Whenever this pendrin undergoes mutation, then we get something known as Pendred syndrome. Okay, Pendred syndrome, what do we have? One thing, obviously we're going to have hypothyroidism. The second thing is going to be have sensory neural hearing loss. Okay, so hypothyroidism and sensory neural hearing loss का जो duo है, that is your Pendred syndrome. Okay, so once the iodine is here, what do we do next? So this iodine is this I2, not I2 in fact, it should be iodine. So this iodine needs to get converted into its nascent molecule, that is I0, okay? Or I3 negative, that is a superiodide molecule. These are more reactive substances. अगर ये बन जाएंगे, then only it can attach with your tyrosine. Okay? How do we convert this? Via the enzyme known as thyroid peroxidase. Along with that, thyroid peroxidase uses hydrogen peroxide. And how do we generate that hydrogen peroxide? By another enzyme, that is dual oxidase. So if someone asks you what are the different enzymes which plays a role in organification, we have TPO and we have duox. Okay? Once the iodide derivatives are developed, I0 and I3 negative, they're going to attach with your tyrosine, and they're going to initially form monoiodotyrosine and diiodotyrosine. Then what happens next is the coupling reaction occurs. Which is the enzyme which stimulates the coupling reaction? Again, it is our friend TPO. So MIT and DIT, they're going to undergo the coupling reaction, and it depends कि कैसे वो react करेंगे. Accordingly, हमारे जो products हैं वो different होंगे. Let's just see what I'm going to talk. क्या हम बात कर रहे हैं अभी? So, for example, if the DIT and the DIT combine together, then we get your T4, right? And whenever we have the MIT and the DIT combining, we can have reverse T3. And then sometimes we can have DIT and MIT combining, that will be your T3. And these are the derivatives we are going to talk about. Okay? Right. So what are the different effects of the thyroid hormone? Let's rush thoda sa. So what the different effects includes that it's calorogenic. It's going to increase the basal metabolic rate. Okay? It's going to increase the number in the surface area of the mitochondria. It's going to stimulate the activity of sodium potassium ATPase. It's going to stimulate the activity of sarcoplasmic endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase, जो हमने already पढ़ा था in muscle contraction की जो हम बात कर रहे थे. It's going to induce this protein known as uncoupler 1, UCP1. So what are uncouplers? Uncouplers वो substances होते हैं which are going to disrupt oxidative phosphorylation. And what do they achieve by that? Basically, whenever we have uncouplers in play, they're components of a brown fat, example thermogenin की हम बात कर रहे हैं, and they're going to generate something known as non-shivering thermogenesis, जिसके accordingly whenever we have in colder environments, तो nape of the neck में जो हमारे brown fat present है, they can burn down, and uncouplers के through they can generate not chemical energy, but they can generate at least heat energy. So जो energy है that is being dissipated as heat, ठीक है? And it's also going to increase the amount of beta receptors, ठीक है? That's a permissive effect, ठीक है? Then what about the carbohydrate metabolism? No substantial effect on the plasma glucose. First thing that I have to tell you. क्यों? Because glucose uptake भी increase करवाएंगे, मतलब diabetogenic तो ये नहीं है. They're going to stimulate gluconeogenesis. They're going to stimulate glycogenolysis. They're going to stimulate glycolysis. So as you can see, glucose increase bhi ho raha hai, decrease bhi ho raha hai, so there is no substantial effect on the plasma glucose, and they're going to increase the amount of insulin being secreted from the beta cells as well. Protein ka mainly proteolysis. Okay? Why I'm telling you that? Hyperthyroidism mein you have muscle wasting, and then you have a very important sign which is known as plumber's sign. Okay? What is this plumber's sign? Plumber's sign is कि जो hyperthyroidism का जो patient है, he has proximal myopathy, is not able to like stand up from his chair, right? Because proximal myopathy है उसे, तो that is your protein metabolism पे role ये है, ठीक है? However, hypothyroidism is also associated with muscle weakness and cramps, ठीक है? That in case of myxedema. What about fat metabolism? Fat में ये है that it promotes lipolysis. That is the reason why hypothyroidism में you have more risk of developing atherosclerosis. ठीक है? What about carotene? Basically, carotene का conversion into vitamin A is facilitated by T3. So sometimes hypothyroidism में you might develop carotenemia as well. That is the yellowish discoloration of the skin, but not the sclera, mind you. Okay, so this is different from jaundice, and obviously it's going to promote your bone growth as well. So these are the different things that you see whenever you're hypothyroidism. आज का हमारा discussion नहीं है ये. Okay, we're going to proceed further. We are only going to study the physiological effects. Okay, the basal metabolic rate is getting increased. Obviously, we know that. So, अगर BMR increase करेगा, then that means we are respiration हम ज़्यादा कर रहे हैं, right? Or basically, so what is going to happen is the PCO2 that's going to build up, and the PO2 is going to decrease, and that is going to serve as a stimulus for increased amount of synthesis of erythropoietin as well. And whenever these are present, it's going to increase the depth and rate of respiration. तो हमारा respiratory system में ये manifestations होगी. What about the GIT? We know that hypothyroidism में we have constipation, and hypothyroidism में we have diarrhea. Why? Because ये जो T3 T4 हैं, they basically increase the amount of GI motility. ठीक है? And what about the CVS? हमने already पढ़ लिया. It's positive chronotropic, inotropic, lusiotropic as well. The important thing is with the blood pressure. It's going to increase the systolic blood pressure. It's going to decrease the diastolic blood pressure because it stimulates beta receptors. Beta receptor mediated vasodilatation के कारण, and SBP due to the increase in stroke volume. So it doesn't know what to do. So there is going to be a normal mean arterial pressure, but the pulse pressure is going to be widened. Very important. Okay? SBP increases, DBP falls, pulse pressure it increases, but there is a normal mean arterial pressure. Cardiac output increases, beta receptors also increases. Whenever we have BMR जब भी increase करेगा तो PO2 decrease हो रहा है. So just remember, whenever we have hypoxia, a very important cardinal rule is hypoxia in every systemic blood vessel is going to lead to vasodilation except the pulmonary capillaries. ठीक है? Just remember that in the pulmonary artery. ठीक है? So there's going to be dilatation of the arterioles that's going to decrease the total peripheral resistance as well as the DBP. It's going to stimulate RAS, so blood volume increase करेगा. Very important thing is alpha myosin heavy chains को ये express करेगा as compared to the beta myosin heavy chain. These have more amount of ATPase activity, तो muscle contraction को ये facilitate करवाएगा. And we saw circa को stimulate करेगा. मतलब everything it's doing for muscle contraction only. And CNS में it's responsible for the normal wakefulness, alertness and responsiveness, for memory, learning capacity, especially when we consider hypothyroidism में creatine समझने कहते हैं, dull बच्चे, ठीक है? तो CNS में हमारा mainly ये है effects, right? So as we saw about T3 and T4, just see the structure. T4 may mainly it's written as 3,5 and 3 prime 5 prime tetraiodothyronine. So there are 4 iodide molecules attached at 3, 5, 3 prime and 5 prime. As इसी के accordingly we also have T3 जिसमें it is 3, 5, 3 prime triiodothyronine, and reverse T3 is the opposite of it. ठीक है? Right, so now we proceed on to the adrenal medulla now. Then we're going to discuss the adrenal cortex. So what is the adrenal medulla? How is it derived? It's derived from the neural crest cells. Okay, we know that. And your adrenal medulla say what is the basic hormone that is getting released? It's mainly adrenaline. 90% of the times it's adrenaline, followed by noradrenaline, followed by dopamine. Very important. Okay, so adrenaline, noradrenaline, and dopamine. Why is it कि adrenaline ही release हो रहा है and nerve fibers में why is it कि noradrenaline release हो रहा है? बहुत अच्छा question है. Mainly the thing is, the nerve fibers होते हैं, they always release noradrenaline. We are going to see the reason behind it. The reason is very simple. Norepinephrine. What does nor means? It doesn't have something. Nor, है ना? We say neither and nor. तो nor का मतलब ये it doesn't have a methyl group. So what is it needs a methyl group. How does it get a methyl group? Norepinephrine gets converted to epinephrine by accepting a methyl group, and the enzyme that facilitates that is PNMT. What is that? Phenylethylamine N-methyl transferase. So it's a methyl transferase. It's going to attach methyl to norepinephrine, converts it into epinephrine. This enzyme is not present in the nerve cells. So if this enzyme is not present in the nerve cell, the major neurotransmitter released by the nerve cells is norepinephrine. Okay? So this is what is happening. Tyrosine gets converted to something known as L-DOPA. Okay? This L-DOPA stands for dihydroxyphenylalanine. So this L-DOPA gets converted to dopamine via dopamine decarboxylase, right? L-DOPA. And then dopamine gets transported inside the vesicle via this transporter known as vesicle monoamine transporter, VMAT1. Okay? This dopamine gets converted to norepinephrine via this enzyme known as dopamine hydroxylase. Abhi norepinephrine is again going to exit the vesicle via this transporter again, that is VMAT. This norepinephrine gets converted to epinephrine via this hormone enzyme known as PNMT, and then again it's going to come back inside if it needs to, in case of adrenal medulla. Okay? So that is the main thing. So what are the different metabolites of the catecholamines? जिसे हम detect करते हैं in the urine. So this epinephrine, it gets converted to metanephrine by this enzyme known as catechol O-methyl transferase. Okay, COMT, right? And this metanephrine gets converted to VMA, that is vanillin mandelic acid, via something known as monoamine oxidase. Okay, so we have COMT and MAO inhibitors. Okay, उसके accordingly, right? And norepinephrine जो है, it can either directly get converted into normetanephrine via COMT, and then again get oxidation via MAO. Ultimately, what is happening is VMA increased होते हैं in case of your pheochromocytoma. ठीक है? So this is what is happening. We've already seen that, and different drugs इस पे act कर सकते हैं. आज हमारा mainly वो topic नहीं है discussion का, so we're not going to discuss that. ठीक है? And pharmacology में you might have read. Just let me give you a brief. कि what is known as the reversal of Dale, what is known as the re-reversal of Dale. ठीक है? So what is just we're going to discuss the vasomotor reversal of Dale. Vasomotor reversal of Dale का मतलब ये है कि whenever we give epinephrine or norepinephrine, it depends upon which receptor is getting stimulated. So initially we might have an increase in the blood pressure due to vasoconstriction, and then we have a delayed decrease via the beta 2 receptors. ठीक है? Mainly beta 2 receptor are more sensitive, right? तो जब भी blood levels fall करेंगे of epinephrine and norepinephrine mainly, then we have a later decrease in the blood pressure. This is the normal response that we get. Okay? Whenever we add an alpha blocker, we're only going to get a beta 2 mediated vasodilatation and decreased BP. Then that is known as vasomotor reversal of Dale, right? So this is the main thing. We were going to discuss that in pharmacology. And these are the different effects of the sympathetic nervous system on the different glands and organs. We are not going to discuss that as well. This is only for your reference. You can watch that. Just focus yourself on epinephrine and norepinephrine and what do they do in fact. Just let me tell you, norepinephrine is basically decreases the heart rate. A very important question. Heart rate in norepinephrine decrease करता है because it tremendously increases the amount of systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure. Very important. तो अगर SBP अगर increase करेगा तो baroreceptor mechanism के through the heart rate is going to fall. This is not the case in case of epinephrine. ठीक है? तो norepinephrine we use it mainly as a vasopressor only to increase the blood pressure. ठीक है? Right. So these are the different effects that you can see: heart rate पे, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, cardiac output, and your total peripheral resistance पे, on the basis कि किन receptors पे वो predominantly act करता है, right? Right. So let's move forward to the adrenal cortex now, right? So adrenal cortex, ठीक है? Where is it developed from? Again, adrenal cortex जो हमारा mesodermal derivative है. The adrenal medulla was derived from the neural crest cells. This is derived from the mesoderm. It's derived from the coelomic epithelium. ठीक है? जो हमारा intraembryonic cavity होता है, that is the coelom, उसका coelomic epithelium intermediate mesoderm से derived है. Basically just like the kidneys, right? So obviously the adrenal cortex is in very close proximation to the kidneys and उसी के relation में वो आता है. ठीक है? And adrenal cortex जो है mainly हमारे पास different उसके portions हैं. As you can see, these are the different relations. These are anatomical aspects are more important. ठीक है? So what I'm going to discuss right now is the different portions of the adrenal cortex. ठीक है? So what is that? So mainly whenever we talk about the adrenal cortex, we have three regions from outside to inside. We have the glomerulosa, zona glomerulosa, we have fasciculata, and we have your reticularis. ठीक है? Glomerulosa, what do I mean by that? मतलब glomerulus, which hormone acts at the kidney? Obviously aldosterone does. तो aldosterone release कौन करेगा? Zona glomerulosa. fasciculator releases cortisol, and your reticularis increases your sex steroids, that is dihydroepiandrosterone and androstenedione. Okay, so these are different sex steroids which are released by that. Important question जो है, that is regarding fetal life. Whenever someone asks you what is the principal hormone being released by the adrenal cortex in adults, it is cortisol. Okay, but in case of fetal life, it is the answer changes to DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone sulfated. It is usually secreted in a conjugated form with the sulfate residue, that is DHEAS. That is the principal steroid hormone in the fetal life. Okay, important. So this is the thing, the zona fasciculata, glomerularis and your reticularis. This is accordingly distributed accordingly कि कितना वो compose करता है, the total part of the adrenal cortex. Okay. Now let's discuss something about the synthesis of these steroid hormones. Please, isme I can't help you actually. Steroid hormone synthesis is very important when we consider congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So isme thode se enzymes हैं which we have to remember. But what I'm going to tell you is about the basic enzyme. What does happen? A concept ban jaye, then you can remember the enzymes later on. What happens actually? So LDL contains this cholesterol, and this is the adrenocortical cell that we have. So it's going to internalize the cholesterol. अब हमारा cholesterol ester आ जाता है. It's going to get converted into cholesterol, and this enzyme जो हमारा cholesterol ester hydrolase, this converts the cholesterol ester to cholesterol. ठीक है? क्यों मैं ये कह रहा हूँ? Because ACTH receptor जो है, which is going to act on the adrenal gland, it stimulates this cholesterol ester hydrolase, and that is why we say ACTH increases the amount of steroid hormone synthesis by stimulating this enzyme limiting step. Okay, this cholesterol, यहाँ पे एक और story है, जो inner membrane of the mitochondria है, what is it composed of? Mainly it is composed of proteins. जब भी हम lipid, when we talk about the cell membrane, ना, there are two questions which frequently comes. Cell membrane, which cell membrane, yes, which membrane in fact, semi-permeable membrane, has the maximum amount of lipid content? तो हम आंसर करते हैं फटाक से, that is your nerve cells. ठीक है? The opposite question comes कि which has the maximum amount of protein content, and उसमें answer changes to inner membrane of the mitochondria. So if it is all composed of proteins and there is no lipid, so do you imagine a cholesterol to enter into the mitochondrial matrix through the inner membrane? No, it cannot. So it needs a transporter. What is that transporter known as? That is the star of the show. That is steroidogenic acute regulatory protein. It transports the cholesterol inside the cholesterol into the mitochondrial matrix, and further just steps हैं, then you can remember accordingly, right? So usme that important, this is the table that I'm going to refer you to, how cholesterol, it gets converted to pregnenolone. Then pregnenolone is acted upon by this enzyme, that is 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, to convert it into progesterone. Progesterone gets converted by 21-alpha hydroxylase into deoxycorticosterone. This deoxycorticosterone gets converted to corticosterone by 11-beta hydroxylase, and then corticosterone gets converted to aldosterone by 18 hydroxylase. That is also known as the aldosterone synthase enzyme, and that is why aldosterone is synthesized. Only thing is, this enzyme, aldosterone synthase, is only present in the zona glomerulosa and nowhere else, and that is why glomerulosa only produces aldosterone. And then the rest of the things we can see, कि pregnenolone gets converted to 17-hydroxypregnenolone with the help of 17-alpha hydroxylase, and then it proceeds on to the same steps, 3-beta followed by 21, then 11. Okay, the same stuff happens again, and then ultimately we have the final products. We have aldosterone, cortisol, dehydro, we have the DHEA and your androstenedione. Only thing again in MCQ, which of the following steroid hormones are actually conjugated when they release? Only DHEA is. वरना और जो सारे हैं, they mainly released as themselves only. ठीक है? So then we can read about CAH as well, but CAH का पढ़ने का भी कोई फायदा नहीं है. Mainly we'll discuss that in pediatrics. But just remember this table, please. It's very important, right? So next we move on to the different effects of these steroids, right? So steroids है हमारे पास, and we have actually बहुत कम left. So we are going to slightly prolong it a bit and just call it a day then. ठीक है? So adrenocorticosteroids. So what do we have? We have glucocorticoids, for example. We have mineralocorticoids, and we have androgens, as you have already seen. Okay. Now we're going to only discuss cortisol now. Cortisol, just remember one thing. It's also known as hydrocortisone. That is the thing that is available. Hydrocortisone gets converted to cortisol, just telling you that. Also known as compound F, pharmacologically speaking. So cortisol, just remember there is a diurnal regulation of cortisol. What do I mean by that? Early morning hours में cortisol के levels maximum होते हैं. And whatever daily secretion of cortisol is there, 75% of that occurs between 4 to 10 a.m. in the morning, right? So it has a diurnal variation. Just remember that. 90% of this cortisol or lipid, any lipid or a steroid hormone is always bound to a protein. Any thyroid hormone is always bound to a protein, whereas these polypeptides and proteins जो हैं, they are mainly free. They are not bound to any protein. ठीक है? So 90% of it is bound to something known as corticosteroid binding globulin. It's an alpha 2 globulin. It's also known as, एक और इसका नाम है, that is transcortin. So sometimes people like to ask you which is the major protein that your steroid hormones bind to, in case जो हम ये पढ़ रहे हैं, that is your corticosteroid binding globulin. It's alpha 2 globulin and it's also known as transcortin. 5 to 10% of it is free and some minimum amount is bound to albumin. Okay, low affinity, right? And just remember, जो synthetic steroids हैं, for example, your dexamethasone वगैरह, they're more bound to albumin ratio wise as compared to your corticosteroid binding globulin because ये बाहर से आ रहे हैं. What is the mechanism of action? Very easy. It's a cytoplasmic receptor. कैसे आता है? I told you, जो हमारे कोई भी अगर ग्लूकोकॉर्टिकॉइड है, फॉर एग्जांपल अभी हम ग्लूकोकॉर्टिकॉइड्स पढ़ रहे हैं, तो ग्लूकोकॉर्टिकॉइड रिसेप्टर इज देयर इन द साइटोप्लाज्म. इट्स गोइंग टू एसोसिएटेड विद दिस थिंग HSP19. इट्स अ हीट चॉक प्रोटीन. ओके, हीट चॉक प्रोटीन के साथ ये बाइंड करेगा. इट्स गोइंग टू फॉर्म दिस डाइमर लिगेंड रिसेप्टर कॉम्प्लेक्स. ठीक है, so it's a dimer. First of all, there is a ligand attached and there is the receptor that we are talking about, that is the glucocorticoid receptor. This glucocorticoid receptor gets internalized into the nucleus and it's going to act on DNA in which we have glucocorticoid responsive elements, GRE, and इसके accordingly जो भी उसकी action है. For example, when we talk about cortisol mainly या फिर कोई भी steroid per se, we mainly talk about as an anti-inflammatory drug. तो जो भी उसके action है, whether it be inhibiting NF-kappa B or whether it be your regulation of other transcription factors as well, mainly anti-inflammatory उसका action है. ठीक है? So what are the effects? This is important. First things, जो first effect है उसका, that is a permissive effect. What do I mean by a permissive effect? It's going to permit something to act. एक तरह का gatekeeper लगा लो. तो what does it permit? Two things. It's going to increase the sensitivity of the vascular smooth muscles and the bronchial smooth muscle to catecholamines. मतलब without steroids, the catecholamines cannot work. That is the permissive action. Same goes for catecholamines cannot do their mainly metabolism वाले roles as well until or unless there is glucocorticoids present. So these are known as the permissive effects. मतलब उनके receptors को regulate करना, उनके receptors की sensitivity increase करना, that is the job of your cortisol. But that's only a permissive effect. What is the metabolic effect? We know it. कि diabetic patients में how does steroids can cause havoc, and we saw it in case of COVID-19 as mucormycosis cases, right? तो क्यों होता है वो? basically because this glucocorticoid जो है, it's going to stimulate gluconeogenesis, generate more glucose. ठीक है, ज़्यादा glucose. What else? It's going to lead to protein catabolism that's going to release the amino acids that is again utilized to form glucose. ठीक है, it's going to increase the serum glucose level. That's going to increase the insulin, obviously. But it's again just like growth hormone, it's an indirect effect. ठीक है, and very importantly, it's going to activate hormone sensitive lipase. It's going to break your TG into free fatty acids and glycerol. ठीक है, what do I mean by that? Actually, अगर हम देखें, in a normal individual, this should not amount to anything. The normal amount of cortisol जो भी है, वो क्या करेगा? एक तो वो इंसुलिन को इंक्रीज करे, तो वो लाइपोजेनेसिस करा रहा है. एंड अभी मैं आपको कह रहा हूँ कि इट्स एक्टिवेट्स हार्मोन सेंसिटिव लाइपेज, तो वो लाइपोलिसिस भी करा रहा है. तो बोथ ऑफ देम विल कैंसल आउट. Why are we so afraid in case of diabetic patients? Is diabetic patients में steroid can increase the amount of lipid levels and that can increase atherogenesis. Why do you say? Because diabetes mellitus में already there is insulin resistance. ठीक है, तो insulin increase नहीं करेगा due to cortisol, and mainly the effect that we get is lipolysis in the form of free fatty acids will increase. ठीक है, it's going to inhibit glucose uptake, so we know it's a diabetogenic hormone. हमें पढ़ लिया हमने. and mainly नेगेटिव नाइट्रोजन बैलेंस, इसका मतलब ये है कि प्रोटीन कैटाबॉलिज्म को स्टिमुलेट करेगा एज अपोज टू योर ग्रोथ हार्मोन. ठीक है, व्हाट अबाउट द फैट? वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग, इट गोइंग टू मेनली रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कराएगा फैट का. बहुत अच्छा मैकेनिज्म है इसके पीछे. जो पेरिफेरल एडिपोसाइट्स एंड ट्रंकल एडिपोसाइट्स, इसका मैकेनिज्म इस पे छुपा हुआ है. ट्रंकल एडिपोसाइट्स जो हैं, राइट, दे आर मोर सेंसिटिव टू योर दैट इज योर, दे आर मोर सेंसिटिव टू इंसुलिन, ट्रंकल वाले. And peripheral adipocytes, they're less sensitive to insulin. What do I mean by that? So whenever जब cortisol अगर आएगा, peripheral adipocytes are the one which are less sensitive to insulin and more sensitive to cortisol. तो cortisol क्या कराएगा? Lipolysis कराएगा, सारा का सारा फैट redistribute होने लग गया. कहाँ जाके redistribute करेगा? To the truncal adipocytes. क्यों? Because the truncal adipocytes are the one which are insulin sensitive. And we saw cortisol increase the serum glucose, and that's going to increase the insulin. And insulin is going to lead to lipogenesis. Do you understand? पेरिफेरल एडिपोसाइट से सारा फैट निकल के अब ट्रंकल एडिपोसाइट्स पे जाएगा, just due to the simple fact of the affinity. The peripheral adipocytes are less sensitive to insulin, more sensitive to corticosteroids, whereas the opposite is true in case of truncal adipocytes, and that is why we get this we get a buffalo hump, or we say कि potato on stick appearance or something like that. That is often seen there कि मतलब बंदा जो है मेनली एडिपोसाइट्स मेनली उसका ट्रंकल फैट ज्यादा होगा as opposed to stick like limbs, right. What does it do? It leads to osteoporosis, we know that, and growth retardation in case of children, we know that as well. And सारे के सारे anti-inflammatory actions इसके कैसे कैसे हैं? Inhibition of interaction with addition molecules, जो भी selectants, integrins है उन्हें inhibit करेगा, we know that. Very importantly is the blood levels पे क्या कराएगा, मतलब blood levels पे कौन कौन से cells को stimulate करेगा, किन को decrease करेगा, बहुत important है ये. तो just remember as a mnemonic BEL, ठीक है. BEL के लेवल्स को इनहिबिट करेगा, मतलब बेसोफिल्स, ईस्नोफिल्स एंड लिम्फोसाइट काउंट इज गोइंग टू डिक्रीज, वेराज न्यूट्रोफिल्स, प्लेटलेट्स एंड आरबीसीज जो कि बच गए हैं उनके लेवल्स विल इंक्रीज. रिमेंबर, बेसोफिल्स, ईस्नोफिल्स, लिम्फोसाइट्स कम होंगे, न्यूट्रोफिल्स, प्लेटलेट्स एंड आरबीसीज बढ़ेंगे. इट इनहिबिट्स दिस एंजाइम नोन एज फॉस्फोलाइपेज A2, तो इसके थ्रू जो हमारे प्रोस्टाग्लैंडिन्स है, ल्यूकोट्राइन्स है, उनका सिंथेसिस भी कम होएगा, एंड ऑब्वियसली COX-2 इज आल्सो इनहिबिटेड. ठीक है, सो दीज आर द इफेक्ट्स ऑफ योर स्टेरॉइड hormones. And the next thing what we were supposed to discuss was aldosterone, but we have already discussed aldosterone in great detail in renal physiology. Aldosterone basically leads to sodium conservation, hyponatremia, it leads to hypokalemia, that is increased potassium excretion, and hypokalemia is always coupled with, as I told you, a dictum, metabolic alkalosis. So whenever a patient is suffering from something known as Conn syndrome, that is hyper aldosteronism, so obviously you're going to have hyponatremia, metabolic alkalosis, and hypokalemia as well, and as well as hypertension due to the hyponatremia. Okay, so this is what's happening, and obviously the opposite will happen in case of your decreased aldosterone that you see. Okay. Next we have there is something one more thing, एक चीज है यूजुअली क्या है ना, ऑन ACTH यूजुअली हम कहते हैं एल्डोस्टेरॉन जो है, हाउ इज एल्डोस्टेरॉन स्टिमुलेटेड व्हेनेवर यू हैव डिक्रीज सोडियम, मान लो सोडियम के लेवल्स कम है बॉडी में, और वी हैव इंक्रीज इन पोटेशियम, और वी हैव RAS. These are the main three potent stimulators of your aldosterone synthesis. Did I mention ACTH? I didn't mention ACTH for a simple fact कि जब हम ACTH पहले एडमिनिस्टर करते हैं ना, we obviously we see an increase in aldosterone, but that output declines in 1 or 2 days. मतलब does it play a role that much ACTH? It does not. मतलब ऐसा भी नहीं है कि उसकी absence में कुछ हो जाएगा, बहुत कुछ होएगा उसकी absence में. But what do I mean by that is कि ACTH doesn't stimulate the aldosterone that much, ठीक है, except in one condition. What is that condition known as? That is known as glucocorticoid remediable aldosteronism. इसमें ये हो रहा है कि cortisol ACTH से तो stimulate होता है ना, but due to some things, you can see the slides later on, it's an autosomal dominant condition. उससे क्या होगा mainly, जो आपका aldosterone है, which was earlier not sensitive to ACTH, it becomes sensitive to ACTH, और ACTH works on the aldosterone, और aldosterone के levels increase हो जाते हैं, and you get hyperaldosteronism. ठीक है, why is it known as glucocorticoid remediable? Because as soon as you give cortisol, as soon as you give a glucocorticoid from outside like dexamethasone, it's going to inhibit ACTH, और जो ACTH अब जो इनिशियली लिंक्ड है एल्डोस्टेरॉन से, जो कि नहीं होना चाहिए था, उसके लेवल्स भी फॉल हो जाएंगे, एंड द पेशेंट इज गोइंग टू बी ट्रीटेड. दैट इज नोन एज ग्लूकोकॉर्टिकोइड रिमीडिएबल एल्डोस्टेरोनिज्म, GRA फॉर शॉर्ट. ठीक है, and we have already talked about renin, angiotensin, aldosteronism is our physiology lectures for renal physiology. You can check that as well. How does it work? Okay, right. Now the last thing that we have is something about the calcium metabolism. So due to time थोड़ा shortage है, so I'm going to discuss something basic, that is this table. What does calcium metabolism do? So just remember, what is vitamin D3 going to do? Let's see that. ठीक है, vitamin D3 क्या क्या करता है? So this is the table I have. So let's talk about vitamin D. Vitamin D, it actually, let's talk about intestine first. Calcium and phosphate का absorption कराएगा. Calcium का through via something known as calcibindin. ठीक है, उसके through it's going to increase the calcium का absorption. Very true. What about the kidney then? Kidney में again it's going to increase दोनों का reabsorption, phosphate का भी, calcium का भी. ठीक है, very importantly, that is the role of your vitamin D. तो ultimately serum calcium and serum phosphate are going to increase. Done हो गया. What about the parathyroid? Parathyroid का stimulus क्या increase होने का? That is decrease in serum calcium. And you can see why does that happen? Parathyroid has something known as calcium sensitive receptor on its surface. ठीक है, whenever calcium के levels कम होते हैं, this calcium sensitive receptor is not stimulated, और यूजुअली एक कैल्शियम सेंसिटिव प्रोटीएज होता है, राइट, and basically that converts your parathyroid जो inactive form है to its active form, ठीक है. तो basically what do I mean by that is whenever there is an increase in calcium, this calcium sensitive receptor is stimulated and that inhibits this calcium sensitive protease and parathyroid hormone नहीं release होता है. And whenever we have the opposite, जब calcium कम होएगा, calcium sensitive receptor कम जो होएगा basically stimulate, calcium sensitive protease जो है अब वो active हो जाएगा and then parathyroid is released. What does parathyroid do? It increases resorption, ठीक है. How does it do that? You can see in the lecture slide as well. Mainly, how does it do that? It mainly expresses something known as rank ligand on the osteoblast. But now you're thinking osteoblast पर iron ligand express करे तो ये तो resorption नहीं कराना चाहिए. But actually क्या है? Ploy ये है कि rank ligand osteoblast पे तो express हो गया. It's going to interact with the rank receptor which is present on the osteoclast. And जो osteoclast है उन्हें activate कर देगा into your mainly जो multinucleated giant cells जो हम देखते हैं, that is the osteoclast which are the house ships lacunae, और वो bone resorption कराएगा, ठीक है. It's going to increase bone resorption. What about the kidney? Kidney में it has a phosphaturic action, मतलब phosphate का reabsorption ये inhibit करेगा, मतलब phosphate excretion कराएगा and calcium का reabsorption कराएगा, ठीक है. And intestine में because this enzyme parathyroid hormone, it stimulates 1-alpha hydroxylase in the kidney. उसके थ्रू it's going to increase the amount of vitamin D, and vitamin D is going to lead to calcium and phosphate absorption from the GIT. It's an indirect effect obviously. So net effect क्या होना चाहिए? Calcium increase होना चाहिए and phosphate decrease होना चाहिए. सही बात है, because इसका phosphaturic action है. Phosphate का reabsorption from the filtrate it's not going to permit, which happens in the PCT. What about calcitonin? नाम में ही है tonin. It's going to tone down the calcium. It's going to tone down calcium. मतलब calcium को ये कम करेगा. तो stimulus क्या होना चाहिए? Increase in calcium. Parafollicular C cells से release होते हैं calcitonin. It's present in the thyroid only. Parafollicular C cells. ठीक है? And you have obviously the medullary thyroid carcinoma which is related to pathology which is derived from the C cells, parafollicular C cells. तो calcitonin ultimately करना क्या चाहिए? Serum calcium को it's going to increase. So let's just go to that table. Parathormone, it's going to increase serum calcium, decrease the serum phosphate. Done. Vitamin D3, it's going to increase the serum calcium, increase the serum phosphate. Done. And what about calcitonin? Mainly it has an effect on the calcium only. It's going to tone down the calcium. ठीक है, एक्शन हमने पढ़ लिया पैराथायराइड हार्मोन का. इट्स गोइंग टू इंक्रीज विटामिन D3 सिंथेसिस. ठीक है, इट वाज नॉट 1-alpha, आई थिंक इट्स 1-alpha ही है, 1-alpha hydroxylase, and calcium reabsorption from the DCT as well as phosphate excretion को stimulate करेगा. तो phosphate levels are going to drop, calcium levels are going to increase, and vitamin D3 are going to mainly increase calcium as well as phosphate. So this was all about calcium metabolism per se. Then obviously you have some, this was what I was talking about actually, कि this parath hormone, it increases the expression of rank ligand on the osteoblast, and whenever this rank ligand is expressed on the osteoblast, it interacts with the rank receptor which is present in the pre-osteoclast, converts them into these osteoclasts which have these house ships lacunae, and ये जो house ships lacunae convert होते हैं into calcium and mainly releases H positive to lead to resorption of the bone. And इसके accordingly we have some drugs which act upon it, so that might be your homework. That is an integration that we have to do with your calcium metabolism. The last thing that we are left with is your insulin now. Insulin, we know it is secreted from the beta cells of the pancreas, and this is the mechanism that we go by. Very important mechanism again. So what happens is whenever this is the beta cell, again this is the image that I've taken from Harrison's. So whenever glucose is transported into the beta cells via this GLUT2 receptor, nothing happens now. This glucose is going to is going to undergo glycolysis, and obviously it's going to increase the amount of ATP. So ATP and ADP का ratio is going to increase now. ठीक है? Whenever ATP increases, very important, there is a ATP sensitive potassium channel. What do I mean by sensitive? Sensitive का मतलब ये है, whenever ATP is going to be there, it's going to be inhibited. Like ENaC was known as amiloride sensitive sodium channels, right? Epithelial sodium channels, ENaC कहते थे हम जिसे. तो ATP sensitive का मतलब ये है, whenever ATP is going to increase, this is going to get inhibited. This ATP sensitive potassium channel, actually it has two subunits. It has a KIR subunit and it has a sulfonylurea receptor. So this SUR is what we'll discuss in pharmacology. We have something known as sulfonylureas which act on this receptor. It's going to inhibit that receptor. So whenever this ATP sensitive potassium channel actually closes, potassium is not going to leak outside. So whenever potassium is not going to leak outside, what's going to happen? Potassium is going to build up inside. Whenever potassium is going to build up inside, what's that going to lead to? That's going to repolarize the membrane. And we know whenever the repolarization of membrane occurs, we have voltage dependent calcium channels opening up. So now the calcium comes inside. And we all know what is going, calcium के दो ही roles हैं, vasoconstriction and exocytosis, right? तो एक्सोसाइटोसिस वो कैसे mediate कराएगा? Via binding to synaptotagmin and the snares, and that's going to lead to release of insulin. Insulin release होगा, C peptide release होगा, as well as something known as insulin associated polypeptide. Okay, so these are the things that are released from it, because we measure the C peptide levels as a proxy marker for your insulin. Okay, so this is what is happening, and we discussed about the KIR and the sulfonylurea as well, and how is it all mediated. Just remember, there is something known as incretins as well. This was observed that whenever you give an infusion of glucose as opposed to a enteral consumption of glucose, the amount of insulin that is released when you consume it via the oral route is more. Then that means there must be some hormones which are released by the GIT whenever you take glucose orally. तो उन hormones को हमने कहते हैं incretins. ठीक है, incretin. तो incretin हमारे पास दो हैं, that is GLP-1 and you have your GIP. And इसके associated GLP-1 के associated, we either have the GLP-1 agonist or we have the diphosphatyl जो हमारे DPP inhibitors होते हैं, right? So what happens? We have a pre-pro-insulin, it gets converted to a pro-insulin, and then it gets converted to an insulin and a C-peptide, just like we know. Okay? And this is what I was talking about. You can see the difference between your GLP-1 and your GIP. L cells secrete GLP, L for L, and your GIP is mainly released by the K cells in the duodenum in the